Prayer, and just taking a nice deep breath in. For fun, we are centered here today to explore the possibility, did God have a wife? What does it mean, the divine feminine, in our Bible stories? As we often read the stories, very rarely is a woman's name even mentioned. And how has that set the tone in the grand patriarchy for 2,000 years? For we know in the truth and the studies that Jesus had many followers, many disciples, and of those there were women. And somewhere along the way they got lost. Somewhere along the way the power was removed from them making their own wise decisions. So we're going to open up this field in the next hour or so and just explore what may or may not have happened, relishing in our own thought patterns, what we hold to be true about the sanctity not only of women, but the balance with men, the divine feminine and the divine masculine. And we just hold our minds open to explore, be curious, examine the mystery. And we are grateful for each person here that is enjoying finding this new piece out about ourselves and about others. And we hold that to be true and complete in our own learning and our own form of mystery. And for this we are so grateful. Grateful for all the questions asked, answered, and asked again. And so it is, and so we let it be. Amen. So I want to start with one of my favorite soundtracks, and those of you who know me well know that I studied with Reverend Edwina Gaines, and she used to have this beautiful property in Mentone, Alabama, specifically Valley Head, Alabama, and in it she had this little chapel that someone had gifted her a stained glass window as a representation of the goddess. And I'm not going to play the whole tract of this, but she opened one of the retreats with this.
We all come from the goddess, and to her we shall return like a drop of rain, flow into the ocean. We all come from the goddess, and to her we shall return like a drop of rain, flow into the ocean. We all come from the goddess, and to her we shall return like a drop of rain.
And for me, the curiosity came when I was at ministerial school. And someone at some point in time said, if you go back and read the story of Genesis, there's actually 3 creation stories within the woman. And when I was young and just read through Genesis, I just knew what I thought I knew on the surface level. But if you go back in the ancient Hebrew teachings of what today we call the Hebrew Bible, most of us know it as the Old Testament, it actually mentions 40 different times Asherah. Sometimes Asherah was referred to as a cluster of trees. And I thought, think about that in the day of the Druids. When the Druids did their mysteries, when they did their rituals, it was always deeply in the forest. And the trees, they believed, not unlike a practice today of tree bathing, where you actually go into the woods, and in the silence you just listen. And some people will say there's a voice amongst the trees, and it calms people down. Well, back in the day, the rituals were conducted back in this way, and Asherah could either be referred to as a grouping of trees, or she was considered a feminine goddess. And so there are indications in different writings that she was the consort or the wife of Elohim, which is an ancient word for God in the Hebrew scriptures. that Christianity teaches there's only one God, but is that true? And part of this to me comes from we declare there is only one God, many paths, but only one God. And that we are an inclusive community. And if we are an inclusive community, what about those people who think differently, either no God whatsoever, such as Buddhism? It is a philosophy, a way, a pattern, a way of life, but they don't hold there to be true a deity, a single deity, as neither does Shintoism, neither does Hinduism, from which Buddhism actually came from. So what about our Native Americans? What do they believe? So unity, our founders, the Fillmores, were choosing the best of the best when they say we have a thread that is common amongst all practices, religions, or spirituality, but not necessarily does everyone agree in monotheism. So this is what I was looking at. How does this come about? Where did monotheism come from? And the top two religions with the most followers in the world do hold a male deity, no surprise, Christianity and Islam. Both of these are Abrahamic religions. And that means obviously coming from Father Abraham, having that commonality. So Christianity is the largest religion with about 2.3 billion followers, and Islam about 1.8 billion followers. Now we know Islam is not just in the Middle East per se. Jakarta, Indonesia, that is the dominant religion practiced there, and it is growing. It is growing. And the true form of Islam may look and be very different than when some of us have misconstrued to be a truth. You know, just like we have people in extremists in the fundamental Christian religion, so they also have that in the Islamic tradition. So the Abrahamic religions, can you name the three of them? We just said Christianity, Islam, Judaism. Right, absolutely, Judaism. And I just mentioned, what do all three have in common? They all trace their origin to the story of Abraham, the father of faith, or the father of a multitude of nations. And if you remember in the Christian tradition, Sarah is unable to conceive, which I think is a foreshadowing down the road when we're going to meet Mary, the mother of Jesus per se. So she is unable to conceive, and she gives her maid slave to her husband, and that woman's name is Hagar. Hator's Egyptian. So Hagar is given to Abraham, and obviously he brings child with her, and that child's name is Ishmael. And that is the beginning of what we hear about for Islam. Things that I remember in the Bible story, Sarah does conceive eventually, and when she births her own son, she wants no question about who's going to inherit from Abraham. So she tells Abraham to take Hagar and Ishmael into the desert and to leave them there to die. Well, in Islam, it is said that she is rescued by one of the messengers of heaven, and she is taken to Mecca. Therefore, Mecca is one of the two places in their lifetime that they're supposed to visit. And they revere her as almost like a saint, but that would not be the words that they might use in the Islamic tradition. So we're seeing that each one of these has a common denominator, and as a test of Abraham's faith to God, we remember the story that he is taking Isaac up into the hillside, and he's supposed to kill his son to prove his devotion to God. Well, the same story is told in Islam about Ishmael. And an angel comes and stays his hand at the last moment, and they sacrifice, often we hear a goat, but if you remember in Christianity, we often say the lamb, like Jesus is the blood of the lamb. We hear that sort of a conversation. So in Ishmael's case, once a year, there is a celebration of staying the hand and allowing life to be. And so they do slaughter a goat as a tradition in Islam every year. And it's really about a big family and a big celebration. And you don't actually have to do a goat. But that's the way the tradition started. So interesting where we all come from in the same earthly place, if you will. Like I would love, Israel's on the top of my bucket list. I want to go and lay down on the ground and touch where all three of the major Abrahamic religions began. And to me, holy space is holy space no matter where it is. But that is top of my bucket list. So we were talking about Judaism, and as of 2021, there were approximately 15 million Jews in the world. I was very surprised by the statistics, 6.9 in Israel, and 6 in America. And I don't know if this is hard to read for you, but I just wanted to kind of outline some of the ideas behind Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And interesting to me, and I didn't find this out until I read some of the Quran, someone from the Islamic faith will think that someone of the Christian faith, we actually have more than one God. Because in the Trinity, we look at God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus. In Islam, they just look at Allah. And often when they are saying any reference to Allah, it's like, peace be with you. Because in the world, it is almost as if you cannot define something so magnificent, such a creator of life, that you cannot even use the words. And so if they do, there's always some reverence when they're speaking of Allah. But for me, it was a curiosity. Unity does talk about the Holy Ghost or the Holy Spirit as the executive director of God, if you will. We do talk about Jesus, but we talk about Jesus as the way shower, as our teacher, as our mentor, as the one that we are emulating to be like. And then that God presence, if we were to take out the personification, the personality of it, just to be that energy existing within all of us. And when we look at Jesus, we're looking at the Christ self, the properties that we would want to emulate to be godlike. And then today we also say that ye are gods, that all that exists within each one of us. So I named a couple of them, but can you name some of the religions that do not have a male deity as their only god or as a deity at all? Buddhist, yep. Yep, Hindi, yep. Shintoism, Native American tradition, shamanism. So I looked up a few to give you some helping hints here. The goddess worship, Confucianism. I was not familiar with Korean shamanism, but there is a small sect that does this. It's more of an ancestral worship. And there's a great reverence in Korea for those who have passed on. My daughter was there teaching for 5 years, and I went to visit, and on the hilltops, you might see the stones, and at those stones, which would be like the headstones that we might have, they often would bring fruit or something to bless them, like an offering, but it's more of a sign of respect. More of a sign of respect. Paganism, Jainism, Taoism. So when you start looking at what is across the world, our world becomes just, like the definition opens up more. Which also leads me to question, only one God? Or maybe it's many facets of what we call the one? So Hinduism is actually the third largest religion in the world, and the belief of a central, universal, supreme being, Brahman. It's thought of a little differently than what we might think in the Christian God, but the interesting part to me, as you can see in this depiction, it is neither male nor female of its own entity, but it shares, it's a marriage. So it's an interwovenness. And as Judith and I looked at this closely last night, she said, don't you think it's interesting, beside the feminine aspect, you've got a male lion, because he has the whole plumage around him. That sounds like birds. Give me another one. Mane, thank you. Because the female tends to be sleek.
Yeah.
Now we know in the pride, she's actually mostly the huntress. And she's the one who takes care of the kids, and she's the one who takes care of him, and yet he's king of the jungle. But isn't it interesting? Look at the divine feminine here, and having that strong masculine presence, and at the same time, she's holding that lotus. And a lotus is a sacred symbol in many different religious spheres and spirituality. You'll see it decorating the temples often in, like Egypt, in Egypt. And then if you look at, maybe that's the Brahmin cow, because Judith and I were asking each other about that one, and I said, but it's got horns, it's got to be a male. And she goes, with the Brahmin cow, which is sacred in India, because you don't eat meat there, actually does have the horns. So just looking at how the regalia is, the jewelry that's dripping, and I know true to form, see what they're holding in their hands, it's almost like a rattle. In Egypt you call it a cistern. And when they rattle that, it's shaking up the energy in the world, it's activating whatever it is that you're bringing forward. So I wanted to share this part. Brahman, also known as Shiva, is married to Shakti. We have the masculine and the feminine, who is the source of all universal principle, energy, power, and creativity. They are not different. They are two equal halves of a supreme being. There's our different religious practice or spiritual practice with a male and a female. So now I'm going to come into Shintoism. This is practiced in Japan within, there we go. Do you know how to say this?
Izanami?
Izanami, does that sound right? Izanami? And so that would be the yin, and it's like that, Izanagi. There's a masculine principle, thank you. And that's the yang. And together it's thought that they created the earth. And this comes from folklore, this comes from a folk belief of nature worship. So moving forward with this, I thought I'm going to share a little piece. In Japan, this beginning of the world commences with the Kamayo, or Age of Gods, an age which begins with a lifeless, silent universe. Sounds begin to indicate the movement of particles throughout the vast, formless space. This movement resulted in light, which remained at the top of the universe. And I thought, what does this sound like? Like, I've heard this in a different context, and this is my favorite passage in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. How interesting. Separate places of the world, similar but different. Similar but different. And through my travels, I find this often. You know, the same idea that in Christianity, the virgin birth, you know, Mary, a messenger of God, comes to her and says she's going to have this baby. That is not so far different. In Egypt, Isis loses her husband to a battle with his brother, unlike Cain and Abel. And Isis, he is spread across the Nile. And she goes to the crocodile god, and she says, help me bring my beloved back together in one piece, for I want to have a child with him. And so she goes to all these different sources to bring back her god, Osiris. And as he's put back together, there's one important piece missing. So she hovers over him and becomes impregnated with their son, who becomes Horus, and he is the leader of the gods. So how fantastic is that? And at the same time, we talk about a virgin birth of Mary. Similar, but different. Shintoism. Oh, we just did that one. Shamanism. Shamanism. This can take many forms. By definition, shamanism is a religion practiced by indigenous people of far northern Europe and Siberia that is characterized by belief in an unseen world of good gods, demons, and ancestral spirits responsive only to the shamans. And I was thinking specifically like in the Aborigines. And some of that might seem too earth-made or fantastical or mystical, and yet they do healings that nobody can explain. You know, I had this trip that I went with Ed Dwayne Gaines to Peru. And the reason I did that trip with her is she kept talking about shape shifting. And she talked about this magnificent black leopard that showed up in her path as she was going through a process. And I'm like, I want to do that. If Ed Dwayne can do that, then I can surely do that. And we embarked on the ayahuasca tear ceremony, and images did appear. However, I never did turn into a leopard or a tiger or anything else. So who practices shamanism? The Arctic peoples, the American Indians, Australian Aboriginals, and certain African groups. I'm just sharing through some of my travels. In Peru, we were having a meal, and they were celebrating something that to be this adorned in such a hideous manner was to chase away the evil spirits. And I think often in shamanism, they show that sort of a thing as well, that you are chasing away something that is not for your highest good. And the second one is just honoring an artist in the Booth Museum in Cartersville of the Native American regalia. And the indigenous Alaskan totem pole was when I went to Alaska a couple of years ago, and that these sit along the waterway. And they do believe, like the Kachina dolls in the Southwest, that they hold certain properties. They either help you along your way, or to chase away evil. Then there's paganism, the Wiccan side. Now, many people have a distorted view of what paganism is, for their credo is to harm none. So therefore, it would not be those that were later demonized by the Christian religion as being the devil worshippers. Instead, these tend to be more of an earth-based nature. Paganism is not considered a religion, but a title that applies to any religion that does not follow the Abrahamic God. I had to kind of pause with that. But is that true? Is that true of shamanism? Is that true of Buddhism? Or is this one person's opinion? So I'm not sure. I'm totally on board with that one. Then there is the goddess worship. We heard Diana, Isis, Kali. Unlike false teachings of the Christian church, pagans are not devil worshippers, and their focus is tuning into the life cycles of the natural elements such as earth, air, fire, and water. Now, I had a group in Marietta that we did a woman's ceremony. And in this woman's ceremony, it was a great big circle. And as you were an initiate coming through, you spent some time in a tent and just honoring who we were as women. Maybe there would be a little ritual or ceremony, often saging, smudging, clearing the air. And then they would hand us a staff. And the day that I went through the process, it had the little sunflowers on it, so I was of the sunflower clan. And there were probably 4 or 5 of us, and we are sponsored or mentored, going through this circle as women are asking, what is your new name? Often when you step into a new you might declare and call yourself something different than what you were born under. And in this particular case, I kept going to the person who was sponsoring us, and I said, nothing's coming. Nothing's coming. But a crow keeps coming in my visible world. And she said, think about what a crow is. And the crow is actually of great integrity. A crow is the mystical to divide up the worlds. We also know they hide the little trinkets in their nest. But the crow is the one who's also of a greater mystery and integrity. So she named me, she who walks with integrity. And as I walked around the circle, the women were chanting that. You had bells and you had drums. We had a big fire. So it was just a very, just an honoring ceremony of where women are, usually after their blood cycles have finished. That we are still magnificent. We are still whole. We're just changing form. In Genesis, going back to the roots of where this possibly could be a wife for God, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, and created them. Have you ever looked at the passage like that? So I looked further into that and I asked the questions, what do you mean them? Are we really pluralistic? What does this mean? And part of the definition, if you were to listen to the Queen of England today and she were to have a private audience with you, she is not likely to say I. She's going to say we, because she's a sovereign of a kingdom, of a nation. Okay, so that's one definition. And in today, when we talk about people who come into this worldly path and they have both male and female organs, then they're not an oddity because they're perfectly created in the likeness and image of the great creator, whatever you believe that to be. So I thought, what does this mean? Is God both male and female? Divine feminine, divine masculine? Is there a marriage like what we just saw back in Japan with Shakti and his beloved? So is there any difference? And if we take personality out of it, you often hear in unity, and not as much today as you used to, Mother, Father, God, honoring the totality. And today we have people in the world who claim neither. And how do we honor that? How do we honor that? Now Lilith is a very interesting character. Have y'all heard about her? She's getting a little more press time than she ever did before. She's actually from ancient Hebrew writings. And one of the quotes I pulled out, and there shall the beast of the desert meet with the jackals, and the wild goat shall cry to his fellow, the Lilith also shall settle there, and find for her a place of rest. I don't exactly know what the Darby Bible is, but this is also mentioned, but not by name, in Isaiah. And interesting, when I look at this and the way that I understood it from days back, Lilith was the first wife of Adam. If you look closely in Genesis, you will find the tribute, but they don't want to say her name. And because she would not lay beneath Adam, but believed that she was equal to Adam, she left him. His second wife was Eve. That's the one we usually hear about. But you have to go back in the ancient text. And unbeknownst to me, as I started doing a little more research, and you're going to see on the next slide, the Dead Sea Scrolls even mentioned Lilith. Well, so you cannot have something that is not ordained by God in the patriarchy. So they chased Lilith away. And Lilith now becomes a winged being. Let's go back to the other slide. Do you see how she's got the wings behind her? She's got the cisterns where she can rattle and activate life. But she's also got these wings because now they make her a demon. And that she actually comes in at night to the children's beds and she takes their life spirit away. Because that makes man, woman hate Lilith. Fear Lilith. And I looked up in the, I think it's the 1900s, the Greco-Roman mythology mentions Alamia, which translates to Lilith. And in this mythology, they see her as a vampire. And she's known to seduce men. Of course, what is a woman? She's either the virgin, she's the mother, or she's the whore. When are they going to let us just be who we are? But this is how things have been designed for a long time. The Talmud mentions, the Babylonian representation of Lilith states that not only is she evil, but she is a seductress. That she shows up when men are sleeping. Again, she's now declared a demon with wings. Whereas in the ancient traditions, she was a woman of her own being. How dare she? This one I love. So I went to Crete. I've actually been a couple times now. And this is from the Palace Knossos. This is one of the most ancient symbols of the goddess mother. And you see with her the snakes in either hand. When she was originally found, and she's only like this big, she's not very tall at all. When she was originally found, she was missing an arm and she was missing her head. So Judith and I were talking about this last night. She said, look really closely what's on the top of her head. What does that look like? So this morning I was discovering it is a cat. But it would not be in the same timeline as the Minoans. So we're not sure what the validity is to that. It could be just an icon, an amulet that they found in a grave close by. But what they do recognize, the snake is all about transformation. She sheds her skin at least once a year. And in that, she is transforming who she is. And if you remember, the life cycle of a woman includes the menses cycle. So blood comes from her, life and death comes from her. And so women were often feared. So they had to be made small at some point. So this one's dated 1600 BCE. The snake goddess was discovered in Crete, dressed like this beautiful Minoan lady at the palace court, with a long skirt and an apron, and the tight bodice. And she would be, as a fertility goddess, she would be a naked-breasted woman, normally really big hips, to show that she could bring forth humankind. So she's often referred to as the mother goddess. These little amulets were taken from inside the museum, and they're hard to depict, but it would be what you might find in a tent or a small house, and it would be in the women's quarters. Because she's looking at this as something to help her maybe attract romance, attract marriage. Maybe she's had children and she's afraid because, many women didn't survive childbirth back in the early days, or for the health and wellness of family. So you'll see many of these little amulets. So here comes some of the good stuff. The Asherah, the consort to El. She is known as the creatress of the gods, and her consort El was the great creator. This is also the name of the Hebrew god, also called Yahweh. Asherah was part of the Israelites beginning with their arrival in Canaan. She was worshipped for about 6 centuries until the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. She was actually in Solomon's temple for 236 years. She's sometimes called the goddess and sometimes Asherah, which also refers to a gathering of trees. In the prophet Jeremiah, he confronts the people of Israel and condemns their practices of burning incense and worshiping other gods. That reminds me of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt have no other God before me. But that says, thou shalt have no other God before me. Doesn't say, thou shalt have no other gods. Reading between the lines. The women responded. As for the word which you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord," this is biblical, "we will not listen to you. But we will do everything that we have vowed. We will burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and pour out libations to her as we did, both we and our fathers and our kings and our princes, in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of food and prospered and saw no evil. But since we left burning the incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out libations to her, we have lacked everything and have been consumed by the sword and by famine." Which just shows you how important it was in the women and the families to have this female, and we may say deity. Men weren't doing it very well, so the women were coming back in there. Asherah is mentioned 40 times throughout the Hebrew Bible, and like this figure you see here, many were found in household shrines. The inscription from ancient Israel tells us that Yahweh and his Asherah were invoked together for personal protection. Cover all bases, the divine masculine and feminine. Genesis is riddled with the knowledge of a divine feminine essence from the origination of woman co-created to Adam in the passage where the serpent is advising that she too could obtain wisdom. Her name's Sophia. Reverend Randy here stopped me after church on Sunday knowing that this class was coming up. And he says, "Do you know in the Sistine Chapel, when you look up there and God and Adam are trying to touch their fingers?" He said, "If you look very closely, the woman is behind God." Have you noticed that? I have too, but I didn't know to look for that.
I saw that.
Oh my gosh, yes. And so I said, "Do you think that was Sophia, wisdom?" And he goes, "Whatever it was, it is a feminine."
It is, definitely.
Oh, cool. So now like all these things, once you know things, you can't unknow them.
Yeah, right.
Like now that you've heard any part of today, you're going to look at things differently.
Yes.
Wow, there's 3 creation stories in the Bible. Who is this Lilith chick? I mean, once you know something, you open up to another understanding. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Talking about Sophia and the tradition and practices of the followers of the goddess, and in the high priestess tradition to the naming of the woman being called Eve, the mother of all living things. And I thought about this morning. When I was in Egypt and we were going through the temples, there is a mythos that the high priestess were sexual priestess for the sake of pleasure in the temple. Well, there is a theory that these women who were in the temple as men went to war and bring this anger back with them and this killing spirit, this energy, this is devastation and destruction, not unlike our men that go to war and never come back the same. And the things they've witnessed, no one is ever going to understand because we weren't present. So they call them temple prostitutes, and that's a misnomer. These women took that anger in. So when the men came in the temple and there was an act of sex going on, it wasn't for pleasure. It was so that they would take in that vibe so these men would not go back to their homes and bring that anger and hatred and spirit of fighting into the homes. Now, it's a philosophy, a thought, a mythos. You'll have to decide what your own truism to it is. But when I walk the grounds, the holy grounds, the sacred grounds, I will call, in the temples of Egypt, I could feel this energy field. And you know, just like every different community, there is going to be a group that comes in to take over. And so what would it feel like, and it doesn't have to be a physical manifestation, but if there was some purification form, that when people step outside into something that is hate-filled, something like war, something as political differences, something as a mismatch in a household of anger, if there was a way that we did have some sort of a process to let it go, to let it go. And so that's what the story is, instead of being temple prostitutes, that they were absorbing that energy so it would not go back into their families, so it would not go back into the townships. It's a thought. Again, another thought. Most of you may know this one. This is one of the most ancient symbols of the mother goddess. This is from Austria. And I understand she's about yay big. She's very small. But she's also prevalent and dates back one of the oldest, the Willendorf goddess, who represents the primordial ancestress who gave birth to all of creation out of her body, to Isis, also known as the conceiver of worlds. And you'll hear Astarte, Asherah. These are all just different numbers of the same divine feminine characteristics, all called the Queen of Heaven. Iana, Ishtar, usually you'll see something with stars around her. Diana is the ancient Sumerian goddess of love, sensuality, fertility, procreation, and she was also a war goddess. So in the Romans, it would have been, maybe not Diana, who would have been Athena? She was wisdom. Diana was of the hunt. But this, to me, a fallacy or a misnomer to say that the divine feminine, is always soft and cultivating. She can be a warrior goddess. She can say that's enough. Look at the lioness. When she's had enough, look at the mother bear. When she's taking care of her cubs, she will take you out. It is clear that while women were often shut out of public rituals and more formal observations of cult, they were accustomed to household and private of religious practice that were uniquely real to them. When I was married to a Jewish man. In the Jewish faith, it is the woman, not the man, who teaches the children religion. Now, I didn't convert to Judaism, and I'm a pretty open person, so if they wanted to follow Dad to the temple at the time, he was not practicing, that would have been an option. I think in the Catholic faith, to raise your children, to have Mass, they do want the woman to convert, if she's not already Catholic, to promise to raise the children like that. So I just find this very interesting that, again, trying to conform to one way of being, and where was the actual religion taught from? The feminine. The feminine. These were more personal, more meaningful, and they found their expressions chiefly in prayers and vows. Women could venerate female deities if they seemed more accessible to them, more congenial, more likely to understand and fill their needs. What is that about? You go into a new place and you look for people that look like you. So why would it not make sense that a woman might want some divine feminine that she could relate to versus maybe the masculine? And there needs to be balance, so I'm not cutting men out. There needs to be balance. Women can be, there's a teaching that the women abuse their power, and that's why the men took over. Yeah, it's a teaching. So Israel was establishing itself under the sole rule of one God, the omnipresent, omnipotent, and supreme ruler. In establishing order, the lead role was man, man in the form of God and man in the form of human man. There was no authority and no rights for a female deity or a female person. Remember, she became chattel. And I think biblically, very rarely do we ever get to hear even a woman's name mentioned. They may say the wife of, the daughter of, but they're not even giving identity to most females. Not in all cases, but much of it. So the goddess becomes a consort. The way of the patriarchal society formed when man developed weapons and charged into war, taking dominion over new lands and people, or to slaughter the conquered people. In the way of the goddess, when we study ancient ways of women who were the drummers, women had no need to be property. They had multiple partners. Until a man said, I want to know who my child is, dominion wasn't established. So now we're looking at weapons of war. Now we're looking at claiming what is mine. There are societies even today that live freely. That they don't, it doesn't have to be a man and a woman. Besides being a woman or man. It doesn't have to be monogamy. There's actual active, live, thriving. Do I say polygamy? Is that the right term? But to choose multiple partners so that you're not owned by anyone. So for me, when I'm talking to friends of mine, and they'll often say an ex when they're divorced, I said, I did not own him. He is not property to me. He is the father of my children. That's a true statement. But he's not my ex because I never owned him. Obviously, he never owned me. Really? Yeah, I was a woman with a hyphenated name before they knew how to do that for a driver's license, whatever. The ancient mother nurturer, life-emerging goddess was replaced with a fierce warrior male deity. Think about the God of the Old Testament. I mean, he was voracious. He wanted you solely to worship him. And if you didn't do what he said, he zapped you. He punished you. Look at Zeus. When Zeus came down in the form of a beautiful swan and mated, but you weren't allowed to know who Zeus was. I mean, what was his wife, Hera? But how jealous was she of all the different things Zeus did? This is very patriarchal. The smaller, weaker sexed woman was reduced to the wife or the consort of man, as was her goddess. So we're looking at the lost mother of Israel. Asherah's image was lost to us not by chance, but by deliberate action of fundamentalist monotheists. First, her images were torn down. Then her stories were rewritten, and her name was forgotten. Archaeologists unearthed a treasure trove of Canaanite stories and other writings in Syria, what's today's Syria, in Israel. And Asherah was absolutely the mother goddess and wife of the Father God. Her name does not appear in the first English translation of the King James Bible. At some point in time, she was no longer allowed to have her power. And these are images that you might recognize of the Divine Mother, and of course Mary's in there. Beneath her, on the bottom, this is in the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. So she is Mother Nature. It's absolutely beautiful. We've got Kuan Yin up in the middle, white, although in white, that's from Korea. Up in the very far corner, I think it must be something that my daughter sent to me in her travels. And then, of course, you recognize the Madonna with the Christ child. And the very far side, there's a beautiful museum in Kansas City, Missouri. And they had a beautiful depiction of different elements of art, and that was depicted there of the Divine Feminine. So the question still bodes for you to answer. Did God have a wife? And the conclusion, God does indeed have a wife, he must. For if we are his children, then we must have a mother. Ta-da!